Welcome to the License to Lead podcast. I'm Patty Fay. This podcast is for physicians or anyone who thinks healthcare needs a transformation led by physicians. License to Lead means that physicians are charged with and must be in charge of guiding the vision, the standards, and the culture of healthcare systems. If you want to join in the conversation or learn more about activating physician leadership, go to license2leadpodcast.com, where you can send me an email or even leave me a voice message. I'd love to hear from you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the License to Lead podcast, episode number 6. This is Patty Fay. In this podcast, I will address the effect of burnout on physician career, on patients, and on healthcare systems. To put this in context, in podcast number 4, I talked about the definition of burnout and controversies swirling around the topic. There are even controversies about the definition of burnout. That podcast, number 4, focused on the underlying causes of burnout in medicine. One of the headlines from that episode was the idea that the toxic effects of burnout happen when physicians face barriers to carrying out their work of patient care. So they're thwarted in their attempts to do their job by lack of adequate support or by overt hassles or by dysfunctional systems like the EHR. In the bigger picture, an overwhelming issue is the lack of physician leadership, which means a lack of congruence between the values of medical professionals to serve the patients and the values of the organization. This is an underpinning fracture in the delivery of medical care, which is why many doctors say burnout is a problem of moral injury. And I agree, that's a huge component. In podcast number 5, I had the opportunity to interview Robin Simon, the filmmaker who directed and produced the documentary titled Do No Harm, Exposing the Hippocratic Hoax. In it, medical students and residents share their stories of mental distress, overwork, isolation, and even suicide attempts. Robin Simon and others have led conversations about the film at over 180 organizations, where they engage medical students, residents, parents, and administrators in the conversation about unnecessary harm during medical training. The interview with Robin, as well as the documentary itself, are both great adjuncts to podcast number 4 about burnout, as well as this current episode. For the first part of the podcast, I've asked 2 people to join me who have perspectives on the topic of physician burnout, a medical student and a neurologist. After hearing from my 2 guests, I'll wrap up the section talking about the impact on physicians, and I'll switch gears to focus on burnout's impact on both patients and the healthcare system. I'll go ahead and say hi to my first guest, neurologist Bruce Katuna. He'll have more to say later in the program, but he's been a victim of my steep learning curve because my first interview with him evaporated into cyberspace. Welcome, and thank you for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having me on again.
Yikes. Bruce and I are married to each other. We both have unconventional careers for physicians, and we both work out of our home offices. Bruce worked as a general neurologist in a multi-specialty clinic for about 15 years before he made the decision to leave. I'll ask him about some of the reasons that led up to his decision to leave that practice. As an introduction to this section on how doctors and their careers are changed and harmed by burnout, I'll take a few minutes here to remind listeners of the language and the proximate causes of burnout. What's actually going on in the workplace that creates these barriers to doctors doing their work of patient care? About 50% of physicians have the occupationally caused syndrome of burnout. And burnout is an imprecise word, but often used, though sometimes more specific descriptions are used, such as moral injury, second victim syndrome, human rights violations, or commoditization of physicians. And I favor this last one because it points to a specific leadership perspective. This comes from the top, and it captures the motivation for permitting a toxic work environment, which is prioritizing profits over patients. But since commoditization is nearly unpronounceable, I doubt that it's going to catch on. The elements most frequently named as creating the barriers and causing burnout are, number 1, administrative tasks and paperwork, which includes all the data entry tasks in the EHR. Number 2, work overload. This is a rigid approach to the quantity and pace of work without recovery time or time to assimilate the information. Number 3, lack of adequate support to accomplish the tasks of patient care. Number 4, chaos, just inefficient processes. Number 5, lack of control or lack of autonomy over the work. And number 6, lack of alignment with the values of the organization. So these make up an inventory of obstacles to providing high-quality care in a setting where physicians lack autonomy to manage their practices and patients. In my first podcast, I made the point that unlike other traditional professions like law and architecture and engineering, medicine is not led by leaders that come from within the profession itself. Instead, physicians have become providers, not leaders, in what Robin Simon, my guest in podcast number 5, referred to as assembly line medicine. In episode 3, I talked about managerialism, or a business school mindset, which is a driver of the toxic systems in healthcare that create and allow burnout. The EHR has a central role in the burnout conversation. Recent studies showed that physicians spend twice as much time working in the EHR as they do working directly with patients. Some of that sort of data is finally giving the EHR the black eye that it deserves. In the past, in order to brush off all the complaints about the EHR, physicians were described as technology-averse dinosaurs. Atul Gawande, who's a surgeon and best-selling author, wrote an article for The New Yorker titled, "Why Doctors Hate Their Computers," and he made the point, quote, "Doctors are the most technologically avid people in society," close quote. We're not tech dinosaurs. We're exhausted and disgusted by bad technology that steals our time, compromises the patient record, and crushes our cognitive bandwidth. All right, first up, let's talk about burnout's impact on physicians. What is the effect of burnout on physicians? What does it mean in terms of the physician and his or her career and life? The most obvious effects are inherent in how burnout is measured in the first place, the emotional and cognitive state that doctors end up in as a result of their work environment. So these are Maslach's 3 domains. Now, as you listen to these 3, just imagine that about half of physicians are working while experiencing one or more of the following. First, emotional exhaustion. This is a profound depletion of emotional and cognitive energy, a sense that they can't keep doing this, and there's no chance to recover. We'll talk more about the need for recovery a little later. And the second is depersonalization or cynicism. And to me, this seems like a natural outcome of emotional exhaustion, a defense mechanism. If I know I'm shortchanging my patients because I'm exhausted, I'll say I don't care. None of this matters. These people don't matter. My MA called in sick. Extra walk-ins have been put into my schedule. I'm 30 minutes behind, and I see my patient is on the verge of tears, but I don't ask about it because I just can't deal with that today. The demands on me and the resources I have to meet those demands are a frightening mismatch day after day after day. And then the third domain is inefficacy, a decreased confidence in my own competence as a physician. I don't have what it takes for this. And when you think about emotional exhaustion, cynicism, and having a lack of confidence in your competence or in your fit with medicine, then think about how a medical error or a malpractice claim, or even missing important family events, or having a conflict with colleagues, how any of those could pile on to shake your confidence and further destroy your motivation and further convince you that you're just not cut out for this. So burnout is linked to medical errors. Physicians who report burnout are more than twice as likely to report having committed a medical error in the previous 3 months. Medical errors increase the likelihood of burnout, and burnout increases the likelihood of errors. Physicians also experience impaired communication with patients. They have more patient complaints and decreased compliance by patients with the physician's recommendation. Another impact of burnout on physicians is the increased likelihood of one of the most devastating hits to the physician career, a malpractice claim. It's hard to overstate how derailing the stress of a lawsuit can be for some physicians. Physicians can be utterly hijacked and unable to stop thinking about it. I witnessed the derangement that happens for some doctors when I was in an executive role. And I sponsored a program of peer outreach to doctors who had had a bad patient outcome or a malpractice claim. According to one malpractice insurance company, on average, physicians spend 50 months, 50, just over 4 years. Can you imagine resolving malpractice claims? And 70% of the time, no payment is made to the plaintiff. So truly, everybody loses a lot in the process. Another impact of burnout on physicians and on the physician's career, work life, and home life, their relationships are disrupted. So coming home late, exhausted and cynical, and then putting their face in the EHR again at night to finish up their records. According to the Medscape 2020 Burnout and Suicide Report, over 70% of physicians with burnout say that it has a negative effect on their marriages and their other relationships. And the majority of physicians who have symptoms related to burnout do not seek any kind of help. There are so many barriers for physicians to access mental health services. Their work schedules, the shortages of psychiatrists, the hassle factor of identifying excellent therapists. I mean, does anyone help with this issue? Confidentiality issues. Many physicians don't trust the confidentiality of the systems that they're in, and they don't want their mental health issues reported in their own patient records. And then the biggest barrier for many physicians is that in a lot of states, the medical board has a requirement to report treatment for mental health related issues. So there's a real risk of affecting medical licensure or credentialing if the physician discloses that they sought mental health services. Now, since this is an occupationally induced syndrome, rather than the physicians having to face all these different repercussions, shouldn't the presence of burnout in an organization instead have repercussions for the leadership of the organization? Maybe a certain rate of burnout in the organization should mandate a 6-month probationary period for the CEO or a formal report to the board and forfeiture of any year-end bonuses. Yes, you're welcome. Please feel free to use that idea. So what behavior do we see by physicians in response to an intolerable work culture? They try to get away from it. They try to move away from the source of the toxicity, as well they should. I applaud the idea of physicians or anyone trying to take care of themselves, trying to create a healthier life for themselves. It's pretty clear that executive teams, HR departments, burnout and wellness researchers, hospital boards, and the myriad specialty societies have at best monitored and measured and just nibbled around the safe edges of this big, ugly, expensive political problem. The best option available for many, and the option that a heck of a lot of physicians have exercised, is to reduce work or leave the organization altogether. Before asking my first guest about his own story, I asked him if he knew anybody currently that he thought was burned out. Here's Bruce.
Going back to the multi-specialty clinic where I was at for 15 years, I have a couple of friends there that are family practice doctors. But over the last, I'd say 6 years, they have expressed continued frustration with their jobs and their careers. They're both unhappy. They would both want to get out of it if they could manage it financially. Their biggest complaint, at least the one that I've heard the most, has been with the electronic health record. It just seems to be killing them.
The two physicians were partners in a multi-specialty group until their group was sold to a large hospital system about 6 years ago.
And I'm sure not having a voice, not having a vote, really impacted them negatively.
Both of his family medicine friends have cut back to just a couple days a week. But for many people, cutting back, especially that much, isn't a viable option, and especially physicians who have huge medical school debts. So physicians move to urgent care or look for some other niche as a way of jumping off the assembly line. Some change careers completely. They run for the Senate or become a real estate agent. I noticed that the American Association for Physician Leadership, the AAPL, was advertising a book titled 50 Non-Clinical Careers for Physicians. The book doesn't really seem compatible with their mission of advancing physician leadership, but on the other hand, they're doing a great service to acknowledge and support a real need, which is the ability to walk away from the deadening effect of corporate medicine. It's not always exhaustion. Some physicians leave when the negatives simply outweigh the positives. This is called asymmetrical rewards. Here's Bruce talking about how he felt after about 15 years as a general neurologist.
I think probably I was burnt out at that point, although not a full-blown manifestation of that.
Neurologists have the second highest rate of all the medical specialties, according to Medscape 2020. So while probably not a full manifestation of burnout, here Bruce describes a chronic mismatch between the upside and the downside of his practice. And there was no upside to his every third night call.
Get there at 3 a.m, which wasn't fun in itself, and then finding out the patient was down on the CAT scanner, and then also having to work that day, so I knew I was going to be tired.
The enthusiasm, which had been there early on, was drained away over time.
I had been sued. That added some, maybe a little drama. And I think I was also a little bit bored with the job at that point after 15 years. So I cut back from 5 days to 4.5 to 4, and then finally to 3 days per week. And what I learned by that was that the less I worked, the less I wanted to work.
He retired. And about 5 years later, someone asked him to help their company with intraoperative monitoring. And as a board-certified electrophysiologist, this was right up his alley. Bruce fell in love with the field and started his own business. The practice ended up growing like crazy.
So really, I had no coverage. So it was just me. What I ended up doing, and it was kind of in slow motion, so I didn't appreciate it for a while, was I painted myself into a corner.
From his home office, which looked kind of like NASA, he could remotely monitor operations all over the country, helping the technicians who were right in the OR if they had questions or if the surgeon had questions about the neurologic status of the patients. The business grew, he didn't have any backup, and he was on call 24/7, so he must have really been burnt out, right?
Interestingly, as I look back at it, I was always enthusiastic about the work, even though I ended up for 2 years averaging 80 to 100 hours of work per week. But I never had that sensation of being burned out. It was all my doing. I was responsible for it. I had put myself in the situation. I was a victim of my own success. And I knew I just had to kind of tough it out, and I wanted to, and I was all in on that. It was the challenge for me.
You can't miss what a huge role autonomy plays in this story. Eventually, he hired 5 neurologists and 3 administrative staff, and we started going out for dinner again. Daniel Pink, in his book Drive, talks about 3 things that constitute drive, motivating factors, that can even allow people to enter a flow state with their work. Autonomy is number 1, and Bruce has autonomy, and he gives everyone in his company autonomy. This is a characteristic of companies run by someone with expertise in the core business. They provide greater support so others can do their jobs well, and according to Amanda Goodall with her research on expert leadership, they provide more autonomy to others in the organization as well. After autonomy, the second factor in drive is mastery. And this was huge for Bruce, learning the IOM field and also learning the business, legal, and HR management of employing people in 4 different time zones and running a business with a presence in a dozen states and in over 300 hospitals. So Daniel Pink's big 3 for harnessing motivation are autonomy, mastery, and then the third is having a purpose.
It's probably what I was missing compared to the new job is I didn't have a vision for where it might go or an enthusiasm for what it might become. And I think that's probably what's been exciting, to be able to create something, have it be successful, to have it all be on me, that I can make the decisions, I have to take all the responsibility.
The company has done great financially, and it has a great quality reputation, and he's had zero turnover. I asked him what he thought about physician leadership. What role has that played?
One of my first employed neurologists had been working for a company that was run also by non-physicians, and he was really sick of that. And one of the reasons why he joined my company, even though I was a fledgling company and just starting up, was because it was physician-run. That was something that he was really tuned into and was looking for that specific change.
100% of the clinical work that he and the other 5 neurologists in his practice do is computer-based, and Bruce says that he does no illegitimate or time-wasting data entry work. The most popular intraoperative monitoring electronic record is customized for the work that they do, and it's customizable. The vendor responds to requests within a few days. The electronic record precisely serves the needs of the doctors and the patients, and it mightily reduces their work of record keeping. I realize that for many physicians, finding this kind of a career is a pipe dream. Okay, I had to look that one up. A pipe dream is an unattainable or fanciful hope referring to a dream experience after smoking opium in a pipe. For some physicians, even cutting back to part-time is a pipe dream. And if options to cut back aren't available, the physician will still reduce work. Someone who's emotionally and cognitively exhausted with no chance for recovery will inevitably cut back because they will be less efficient, less productive. They'll feel less capable. And as you can imagine, someone who's emotionally and cognitively exhausted will probably drag down the energy of staff and colleagues. Work is reduced as a result of burnout one way or another. An important effect of burnout on physicians, with implications for patients and the team and the organization for that matter, is that the quality of their work deteriorates. I mean, little wonder burnout impairs the prefrontal cortex, the most advanced part of our brain that allows us to be doctors. It allows us to be analytical, creative, decisive, open-minded. It allows us to think strategically and to recall events and to inhibit impulses. All that is impaired in burnout. Yet another impact on physicians is they have more car accidents. There's a statistically significant increase in motor vehicle accidents involving physicians with burnout compared to the general population, even after adjusting for fatigue. Besides car accidents, there are other physical effects on physicians as a result of burnout. It's associated with headaches, GI disorders, muscle tension, hypertension, and sleep disturbances. Headaches were a big part of my most stressful doctor role. When I was fresh out of training, I joined a big healthcare organization, and in my local office, there were 4 unhappy physicians who did not like being there. It wasn't long before the most dissatisfied and the most complicated and the very most depressed patients moved away from my colleagues right into my every 15-minute schedule. All the wheelchairs seemed to roll toward my hallway. Staff would put the people in my schedule who begged for a doctor who would, quote, spend more time with them, close quote. At 5 p.m. each day, my partners would pick their way around the wheelchairs in my hallway and wave goodnight as they headed out the back door. I was exhausted. I had no control over an impossible schedule that included rounding an overnight hospital call. And I started getting headaches every day around noon. And on Friday night, I would start to dread Monday morning. And before that situation, the only time I'd even had a memorable headache was during the Broadway musical Cats. But that was after a long flight to New York City and no sleep. And, it was, after all, Cats. After about 18 months, we moved, and I joined a great bunch of physicians, had a reasonable schedule, and I worked with a fantastic nurse. I enjoyed my weekends. I didn't dread Monday, and the headaches were long gone. Self-medication is another negative effect of burnout. For physicians, the drug of choice is alcohol. Male physicians abuse alcohol at a higher rate than the general population. So 13% of male physicians abuse alcohol versus 8% of the general population. And the rate's even higher for female physicians. 22% of female physicians abuse alcohol versus 4.2% of women in the general population. Physicians suffering from burnout and depression may have feelings of isolation. They might feel like failures. They become isolated from colleagues. The physician with burnout believes that others are coping better than they are. Physicians can start to think that they're a burden on partners, families, friends. And all of these factors can drive some to consider suicide. Suicide can appear to be the only way out of the pain and shame and exhaustion and failure. The true rate of suicide among physicians is unknown, but it's certainly higher than what's captured on death certificates. A recent meta-analysis confirmed that female physicians have a significantly higher suicide rate than women in the general population. Most reports, including the annual Medscape U.S. Physician Burnout and Suicide Report, state that approximately 400 physicians per year die by suicide. I want to shift my focus to burnout among medical students and residents, and really that group deserves their own podcast on this topic. But in lieu of that, please do make a point of watching the film Do No Harm. You can go to donoharmfilm.com. And it's about medical students and residents, and it's eye-opening. It's an important film. Many of the factors I mentioned are true for medical students and residents, but worse because of the power differential. Medical students and residents often feel that they have no agency. They're under the thumb of anyone who might have input into their evaluations, anyone who could derail their future. My second guest is my daughter, Jamie, who's entering her 4th year of medical school. I asked her about stress and burnout in med school, starting with the first 2 years.
So I think the hardest part of the first 2 years was just the volume and like the incessant nature of being kind of tested and scrutinized and analyzed and evaluated. It seems like your whole identity sort of becomes your test scores and your Z-score and what's your average compared to everyone else in your class. And then all of that culminates in the step 1 exam, which is sort of notoriously difficult and important. It kind of determines what we can go into for the rest of our lives.
I asked her about the level of stress that she saw among her classmates.
For example, studying for step 1, one of my classmates would text me and say that she just cries for no reason now and just exhausted and frustrated and doesn't really know what it's all for.
I asked her how they handle the stigma if somebody needs some counseling.
But it's not stigmatized at my school. We have mental health counselors and programs put in place that you can be a part of.
Jamie also mentions this.
Support and resources that they make very public and very available and encourage us to seek it out if we need it. The stories about people going out of state or out of their city and paying cash for mental health support is not something that I'm personally familiar with.
This next comment from Jamie is a great example of how an organization can handle illegitimate tasks.
I think our school actually does an excellent job at kind of supporting us through the curriculum that's currently mandated of medical students.
Jamie is describing curriculum and tasks that both students and faculty recognize to be illegitimate, although I'm sure none of them would be using that terminology. But the huge volume of stuff to be memorized in the first 2 years of medical school, culminating in the step 1 exam, which doesn't correlate to future positive performance, but does determine their future residency options long before they've even had a clinical rotation. This is the definition of a constellation of illegitimate tasks. In a 2016 dissertation, Marcus Fila described how in higher education, illegitimate tasks can increase anxiety, and offering more autonomy about how to do those tasks does not alleviate the stress. Unlike legitimate tasks, like, for instance, Bruce's enormous workload and incessant call, that was almost completely mitigated by his level of autonomy. But when the tasks are busy work or unfairly burdensome in some way, what can help is support, acknowledgement of the issue by faculty, and a supportive posture. Listen to how Jamie describes exactly that.
I agree. I think, our school almost took the stance of like, yeah, we know studying for 8 weeks or 12 weeks at the end of your second year for a test. It didn't used to be like that. It shouldn't be like that now, but we have to do that. So like, here's how we're going to support you through that. I think the open door policy where you can walk into a dean's office or faculty office at any time is really helpful because they really honor it. Like they'll stop what they're doing and help you with whatever you need.
As is the trend, her school created a wellness program with mandatory group activities. One student wrote a letter on behalf of the class requesting that the activities be optional, pointing out that more required activities were not going to help their well-being. The dean agreed. There's a good lesson about autonomy because now there's more willing participation in the program.
More participation now that people don't resent the fact that they're mandatory, but just like an optional go play dodgeball day.
The recoil that the students in her class had to mandatory well-being classes or activities goes along with the findings of a longitudinal study done looking at the results of a mandatory well-being course for first-year medical students at the Mayo Clinic. The Mayo Clinic had gotten some positive feedback about voluntary resilience or well-being programs, so they created a mandatory program for first-year students, and the results actually showed a decline in well-being scores and increased stress scores, not only over the course of the first year of medical school, but in comparison to previous classes who didn't have the well-being program. I asked Jamie about the biggest stressors in the third year of medical school.
There's a power dynamic in your third year of med school where you need that person's evaluation. If something does come up that you might disagree with, or if someone says something that's rude, you just do not have any ground to stand on to say the thing that you would actually feel to say. So there's a suppression of what feels authentic, and I think that's what feels exhausting.
We know that faculty and preceptors are a big part of the experience of third and fourth year medical students as well as residents. I asked Jamie if she could give me an example of a suboptimal preceptor.
I would follow him into exam rooms, and he would have me stand behind him, stand, not sit, behind him, while he talked to the patient, while he examined the patient, and while he wrote the note on the patient. And then we'd walk out and he would work on the computer a little bit more. And then we'd do that again in the next room. And we call that, and like my classmates and I call that fly on the wall precepting, where they just have you be a fly on the wall and don't engage you at all, which it's just really hard to stay engaged. Every fiber in your body just wants you to leave and go do something that's more worth your time if you're not learning anything and if you're kind of being shoved to the side.
And I asked her about her excellent preceptors.
One of my internal medicine preceptors was so great for students. In between cases, he would draw stuff out on a whiteboard and ask us questions. He would never make us feel like we were bothering him with questions.
She mentioned another clinician who was an excellent mentor.
Surgery preceptor who was super engaging for me and taught me so much and let me do so much and gave me so much freedom and was very like honoring of my interests.
Thanks, Jamie, for being on the podcast. Jamie's school clearly takes medical student well-being seriously. An approach to reduce the pressure cooker environment has been described by Dr. Stuart Slavin in a 2019 article in Academic Medicine. He was able to dramatically improve medical student anxiety and depression while also improving academic performance at the St. Louis University School of Medicine. And these positive approaches stand in sharp contrast to the harrowing experiences described by students in the documentary Do No Harm. We know that medical students about to enter medical school are emotionally more stable and have lower rates of burnout and depression than peers. But once in medical school, their rates of burnout and depression become a lot higher than peers, and their scores on empathy assessments decline year after year of medical school. The rate of suicidal ideation prior to medical school is 2.5%. And once in medical school, the rate of suicidal ideation quadruples to 11%, and less than half of the medical students who consider suicide receive counseling. Almost everyone in the United States is affected by how physicians are trained. We're all stakeholders. Next, a few comments about the impact of burnout on residents. In a large 2018 study out of the Mayo Clinic, the rate of burnout among residents is variable depending on the specialty, but it ranges from 30% to 64%. And the rate is variable because of the lack of consensus on defining and measuring burnout, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. Many reports that I've seen describe residency burnout rates of 75% and more, so we'll just have to endure those inconsistencies and focus on the harm and how to reduce it. When looking at the differences among residents in different specialties, the rate seems to reflect, or I suppose predict, the burnout rates among attending physicians in the same specialty. So either elements of the specialty itself could be the main culprit, or the dissatisfaction and disengagement of attending physicians could be rubbing off on the residents. Residency is a uniquely harrowing time for physicians, and the training has what one author described as structural trauma. Everything from overwhelming workloads, sleep deprivation, lousy pay, disrespectful treatment from a variety of sources, even enculturated trauma in the form of pimping and illegitimate work or scut work. Scut, by another name, rolls right downhill into the resident's lap. So what are the impacts on residents? High burnout rates by specialty are associated with career regret, wishing they hadn't chosen to become a physician, and associated with specialty regret. Why did I choose urology or neurology? According to a JAMA editorial titled Resident Depression, the tip of a graduate medical education iceberg, burnout is associated with lying about clinical data, medical errors, ethical lapses, and it's associated with less altruistic and compassionate care. According to a JAMA meta-analysis, between 1/4 and 1/3 of residents have significant symptoms of depression during residency. So what is the impact of burnout on residents? A significant part is mediated by residents' sleep deprivation. Mood disorders, car accidents, lack of empathy, medical errors are all increased in residency, and all are associated with sleep deprivation. In 2009, the Institute of Medicine made a clear recommendation that residents not be allowed to work shifts longer than 12 to 16 hours, and they needed to have a minimum of 10 hours off between shifts. And this recommendation was made based on data related to sleep deprivation and with concerns about patient safety. However, the ACGME and residency programs all over the country have set aside those recommendations. The big iCompare study, which looked at resident hours, compared a group who had a 16-hour cap on their shifts to a group who could work 24 hours or more. I gotta say, this has been a humdinger for me to read through and figure out. The way that this study has been interpreted and described by some seems quite cynical to me. A couple things. Think about a 16-hour shift. So that would be, for instance, from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. That seems plenty long. And the fact that the arm of the study with 24-hour or 28-hour shifts was called, quote, flexible hours, close quote. I mean, what is that? Flexible because they get to work 24 or more hours? I don't know if that was tongue-in-cheek or if the authors were just tipping their hand towards their own bias. And then there's this part of the study design. When shorter shifts were put in place, there was no extra funding to provide more clinical staff to cover the decreased hours of the residents. So the residents with 16-hour limits had work compression, which is a fancy way of saying the residents had to do the same amount of work in a shorter period of time. Now, that was probably stressful. It seems that the lack of improved patient outcomes among residents with the shorter duty shifts was interpreted to mean that the longer shifts were fine. And I just had to go sit down in a comfortable chair to think about that interpretation, rather than the more likely interpretation based on what we know about the effects of sleep deprivation and elements of adult learning, which would be that both arms of that study are ridiculous from an adult learning and sleep hygiene perspective. Josh Mohn, who's a PhD student studying performance during medical training, makes the point that the iCompare study simply shows that 16-hour shifts with sleep deprivation create similar findings to 28-hour shifts with sleep deprivation. As he says, why would we expect an improvement when moving from abysmal to bad in the sleep debt department? Or I suppose if you consider the work compression of those with the shorter shifts, you could even argue that they were comparing abysmal to abysmal. Josh Mohn has a particular interest in the effects of sleep deprivation on performance. He refutes the idea that long shifts and cumulative sleep debt trains doctors to function without sleep. He points to extensive studies in the military that make it clear that lots of sleep deprivation does not build up to a capacity to function better while sleep deprived. Those who benefit from having residents in the hospitals for cheap state that the long shifts are in the interest of residents having the opportunity to provide continuity of care for patients. But it very much appears to be in the interest of residents providing continuity of exceedingly cheap labor to keep hospitals functioning and keep costs low. Sleep-deprived residents and their patients are not likely to be capitalizing on patient continuity when the doctor's cognition, memory, and judgment are impaired. The sleep deprivation, time pressure, scut work, lack of agency, very low pay, loneliness, and huge debt are the ticking time bombs that occupy that place we call residency. So that was some of the effects and some of the issues related to burnout on attending physicians, residents, and physicians-to-be. And next, we'll look at the impact of physician burnout on patients as well as on the healthcare system itself. How does burnout affect patients and healthcare, including finances? All right, first up, how does burnout affect patients? The effect on patients flows directly from the impact of burnout on physicians. When physicians, one way or another, cut back, change careers, or retire, patients lose access to medical care. They lose the attention and compassion of their physicians. Some patients are complicated. They require a lot of a physician's time or attention, and they need a physician with the capacity to go over the top. A physician who is supported to do the work of patient care can and will, of course, navigate all the needs of challenging patients. That's exactly what a physician is driven to do. But in the context of burnout, of emotional exhaustion, of an unrelenting workload without time for recovery, and hours of illegitimate work, something has to give. So patients lose the over-the-top advocacy by their physician, and they lose their physician altogether if he or she leaves for another organization or career, or if the physician chooses to retire early. And patients lose in even more ominous ways. Patients are at risk of being harmed. Physicians with burnout are 3 times as likely to receive low satisfaction ratings from patients, and they're twice as likely to deliver suboptimal care to patients. As I mentioned earlier, malpractice claims are devastating for physicians and difficult and infuriating for patients. The anger and real harm, or even perceived harm, that drives them to take such an action is no doubt a profoundly negative experience. And finally, the biggest loss, patients are at risk of losing their lives by being victims of medical errors. This is rare, but horrendous. And by the way, despite almost no end to the use of this flagrant error stated as fact, medical error is not the third leading cause of death in the United States. The 2016 BMJ article and authors and their so-called data and analysis have been discredited. Anyone listening should fact-check that so that you can help stop this bizarre claim that overstates deaths due to medical error by more than 10 times. But nonetheless, any death caused by medical error is too many, and to the extent that burnout contributes to the risk, it's just that much more important to address the underlying causes. In addition to this focus on whether a physician with burnout is more likely to commit a medical error, an important consideration is whether physician burnout and patient harm from medical error have a common etiology. A May 2020 article out of Johns Hopkins is a review of the most common diagnostic errors. In a Medscape article, Gordon Schiff, MD from Brigham and Women's, commented on the research by pointing to our fractured health systems. He said one problem is the lack of time physicians have with each patient to determine whether symptoms could be serious. So a common etiology for both the decimation of physician careers and the increased risk of medical error and patient harm is the profits and productivity assembly lines that many physicians currently work on. How does burnout affect the healthcare system and finances? Let's talk about organizational culture. If the ship is sinking, the healthiest rats jump ship. The physicians and staff with the most options are the most likely to leave. So over time, a toxic organization is drained of talent, and the loss of great people causes the morale of departments to crater. That causes other physicians and staff to decrease their discretionary effort as they contemplate their own escape routes. When organizational culture and results really tank, organizations might choose to bring in a turnaround agent, maybe someone who can really get those doctors in line, and someone who doesn't shrink from whacking away at that unnecessary overhead known as staff, bedside nurses, and the highly paid, loyal, long-term employees. The failed leadership of a business school mindset leads to fixes generated by an even more aggressive business school mindset. So they double down on the measurement, monitoring, and short-term financial fixes. When leadership prioritizes profits over patients and excellent medical care, it's unlikely that physician burnout will get much attention. Where's the business case, after all? Patients are being seen. The coding and data entry is getting done, right? The revenue's being generated. So what if a few doctors jump ship? The true costs of burnout are not easily measured. Even the true financial costs of burnout are not easily measured, much less the broad impact on reputation, quality outcomes, recruiting ability, and more. And certainly not fully measured in the short term. And if you listen to podcast number 3, you heard that short financial timelines and easy to measure factors are characteristic of the business school mindset. When excellent physicians leave, the reputation of a hospital or system spirals downward, and the loss of talent, combined with poor morale of those left behind, degrades performance further. It becomes harder to attract excellent physicians and staff, and certainly harder to compete with nearby hospitals and groups. And if it's a teaching institution with a toxic culture, the organization will have difficulty recruiting the best residents to stay on, or any residents to stay on. And that's a red flag. Here's a job hunting tip. If a teaching institution can't hire any of their own residents, run away. All of these factors contribute to the point made in an editorial in Mayo Clinic Proceedings by Dr. Christine D. Olson. She talked about recent data regarding the impact of burnout and said that physician well-being must be recognized as an important quality indicator in healthcare systems. And supporting that concept, the lead author, Michael Privatera, MD, of a Burnout Task Force report, said healthcare organizations should be concerned that the so-called ideal doctors, those they might most want to retain, physicians who are most vigilant about providing excellent care, may be the ones especially prone to burnout if their efforts are frustrated by a dysfunctional system. Privatera also said that physician burnout may be the best early indicator of dysfunction within a healthcare system, and that it's important to address the issue of burnout before errors occur. And finally, what are the financial costs of a 50% physician burnout rate? The most obvious costs are related to lost productivity and the recruitment and replacement costs of physician turnover. A 2019 Annals of Internal Medicine analysis describes U.S. healthcare costs of $4.6 billion due to reduction of hours and physician turnover due to burnout. I think the real costs of burnout are enormous and unknown because there are no line items on the profit and loss statements for discretionary effort, ability to attract the best doctors and nurses, willingness to refer family members and friends for care, or willingness to recruit excellent physician friends to join the medical group or the system, or for all the great PR with physicians recognized as experts for local media, and just having fewer ugly incidents that create headlines in the media. Excellent nursing staff who stay late to help and who stay for 30 years because they love the place. There's more innovation because people want to make the healthcare system where they work better. When an organization has an excellent culture, it starts to rain money. And when an organization has a dysfunctional culture with high levels of burnout, the money and the margin drains away in dozens of different directions. To name a half a dozen, number one, ludicrous CEO and executive compensation, which is divorced from meaningful performance. Number 2, relentless turnover, but especially of high performers. Number 3, huge separation agreements. Number 4, the best people won't even consider taking a leadership position. Number 5, a culture that extinguishes innovation. And number 6, an inability to hire the very best talent. And those were just the first half dozen or so that came to mind. Okay, back to specific costs. Physicians suffering from burnout make more referrals. They order more tests. Their patients are less compliant, and that can drive more ED visits and more hospitalizations. In a 2017 article in Mayo Clinic Proceedings, Sinsky et al. Said that burnout and dissatisfaction with the EHR are independent predictors of a physician's intent to reduce hours or leave. And their national survey showed that 25% of physicians reported an intention to leave the organization within 2 years. And what seemed to surprise the authors, even more than 25% of physicians planning to leave the organization within 2 years, is the fact that 2% of doctors who were surveyed said they intended to leave medicine altogether. Sinsky points out that if just a third of this group that intends to bail out of medicine altogether actually follow through, that would mean that 4,500 doctors across the U.S. would leave medicine altogether. And all of that in the face of an already projected shortfall of 45 to 90,000 physicians by 2025. Sinsky makes the point that efforts to increase the pipeline by building more medical schools can't possibly keep up with this additional defection of 4,500 doctors from medical practice due to professional burnout. So, reducing burnout warrants at least as much attention and investment as that's being poured into building, staffing, and running more medical schools. Okay, time to wrap up License to Lead episode number 6. Some action ideas. First, there's a great article by Stuart Slavin, MD, in which he describes remarkable improvements in medical student mental health and medical student satisfaction without sacrificing test scores. And the article is titled Reflections on a Decade Leading a Medical Student Wellbeing Initiative, and it's in the journal Academic Medicine in June of 2019. And you can also find a link to the article in the show notes for this episode at license2leadpodcast.com. And then secondly, in the last few podcasts, I've covered a lot of territory related to physician dissatisfaction and dysfunctional healthcare systems with the resultant burnout. In this podcast, I focused on the impact on physicians' lives and on patients and healthcare systems. Why has there been such a stunning lack of progress in addressing the degraded work lives of physicians? Why is there so much monitoring and so much published, but so little action regarding this hyper-endemic of burnout within the medical profession? My next podcast is dedicated to exactly that. Why are we so stuck? Thank you for joining me for the License to Lead podcast, and I would love to hear from you. Are you all in with your work as a physician, or are you looking for a way out? Have you seen leaders who've been able to knock away the barriers that get in the way of taking great care of patients? And do you know someone who's been a remarkable leader during the COVID-19 crisis? Contact me at license2leadpodcast.com. You can send me a voicemail from that page or send me an email. Thank you so much for the work you do, the leadership you demonstrate, and as always, for all your care and caring. To learn more about how we work with physicians and other leaders to create healthy work cultures, or to join in the conversation for future podcasts, go to license2leadpodcast.com, where you can send me an email or leave me a voice message.